Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Turnip's Digest, starting right on time at 8 o'clock in the morning, Central Standard Time. As you may be able to see, this has potential to just be a solo stream today, simply for the fact that I don't know where Sandbatch is, and I don't feel like just calling this off for 2 weeks in a row. So that's very unfortunate just because Sandbatch was supposed to bring the knowledge about specific individuals, being as he might have personal experience with a lot of them. I have no such thing because I was born in the year 2003, where most of these people were basically entering their retirement after a long, long political life. And on top of that, I have not just read every single book about them. I have not been around long enough to do so and read all the other books that I have. So this stream probably won't be as long as it would have been. Not as much discussion because there's just one person monologuing, but we will still go through something that most people often neglect, which is how did the parties change over time. So we're going to be going through a bunch of political party platforms today, just to show how parties might have changed over time and more to highlight my view that the party flip is more of a lie, but probably not in the sense that you might think. But we'll keep to the promise of the title of the stream. We'll start with talking about the Dixiecrats. So if we just take a look here, I don't know how visible this is to you people watching at home, but this should be the 1948 Oklahoma City Convention for the States' Rights Democratic Party. And in fact, hopefully this will work, I will throw in the link to the live chat so that you can play along at home. There we go. So, who on earth are the Dixiecrats for people that don't know? They are usually considered to be the southern faction of the Democratic Party halfway through the last century. The way that the Democratic Party was organized typically goes with you had sort of a progressive wing that tended to be northern and west coast-like. The progressives weren't always sort of like your bleeding heart ultra leftist socialists, like many people would think of a progressive Democrat today. Some of them were oftentimes actually moral and religious. What they would tend to advocate for, though, was increased welfare state, potentially integration, but that was a more radical position as time went on. The States' Rights Democratic Party is the sort of formalization of the southern, more conservative wing. Don't let that sort of mistake you, though. They were not the opposite of the progressive northern wing. Very oftentimes, the sort of southern wing would not just be a mirror image of the progressives and just try to roll everything back, be conservatives. Somehow they were still under the same party. Notable figures like George Wallace, Faubus, Strom Thurmond, they did not really roll back any sort of the welfare state. They mainly opposed things like integration. They opposed the sort of social progressivism of the Northern Democrats. They were very oftentimes hardcore or hardline Christians, though it's been speculated as to whether or not the Dixiecratic Christian section was genuine, or if that was just sort of a play for political power and votes. A very famous story would be that Governor Wallace, later into his life, after having been having an attempted assassination on him, and after renouncing his segregationist policies in the 80s, had a born-again experience as a Southern Christian. There's a rightful skepticism as to whether this is genuine or if that was just to keep his office and political standing. We're not going to speculate on that, though. That all you need to know for the purposes of the stream today is that this is the more conservative wing of the Democratic Party, the Dixiecrats, and they would later go off to break away, having perceived both the GOP and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party as being the dominant powers, and also as being much too progressive. Because earlier on, there was a progressive wing of the Democratic Party. This is around the year 1948, so just after FDR's multi-term reign of terror, if you will, going into Harry Truman. This progressive faction of the Democratic Party had not really been in power, just for the simple fact, think about the time period. In post-Reconstruction society, you very rarely had a Democratic president that was any extreme one way or the other. Someone like Woodrow Wilson might come to mind, who in modern historiography we view as some sort of extreme figure, just because of his foreign policy ramifications. This didn't really bear out in the domestic scene. Woodrow Wilson tended to take a much more conservative view of things, certainly, but something like segregating the federal government, implementing the Federal Reserve, none of these things were really seen as too terribly extreme by the average person. So that's sort of like your archetypal conservative Democrat for this age, because by 1948, Woodrow Wilson's presidency was just a few decades old. So not that extreme. FDR and Truman, the sort of first real social progressives, if you will, rather extreme. It would cause a divide in the Democratic Party, just because near the beginning, FDR had a coalition of conservative Democrats and progressive Democrats and various other ethnic and religious minority groups like Roman Catholics. Some of them were New York City types. Hopefully you can get the euphemism. Other ones were, you would get sort of like the Mexicans sort of in the South that were still there. This is before mass immigration from the southern border. But they still existed from when they were, from before the conquest in 1848. All of these groups, plus most of the middle class, quite a few elites, would support FDR, who originally kept mostly quiet on social issues, promised a lot of conservative economic reforms that he never carried out on. That is a political party platform. I believe it would be 1932, the Democratic platform. That's something to look at, but not right now, because that could do its own 3-hour video just on how foreign it sounds from the actual FDR administration. But anyways, he built a coalition around this stuff, promising not to rock the boat too terribly, but also he wanted to deliver on financial aid and assistance to the hurting parts of America due to the Great Depression. Anyone that would be from the more non-interventionist, either Chicagoite or Austrian school, I don't think they necessarily disagree on this, recognizes that a lot of these interventions most definitely prolonged the pain of the Depression, but that's not how politics works. If you promise people money and assistance for basically nothing while they're starving, you will be popular. And this is exactly what FDR did. So that Southern conservative wing that we mentioned earlier that was not opposed to welfare would cling on to FDR and coalition, which is why you see much more radically conservative figures like the Roman Catholic Charles Coughlin supporting FDR initially. You would see people like a lot of the soon-to-be segregationists, the ones that were old enough to partake in these political times, 1932 to 1948. You would see them as well supporting FDR just because the South, for the very most part, was an economic backwater. A lot of Southern historians will point to the fact that they had rather punitive terms enforced on them by the North after the Civil War. Their economic development was, legally hindered, in law. You would have train fares, I believe, would be the thing that's usually pointed to if you wanted to export out of the South. Actually produce and sell to people, you would have to pay an extra fee just because you were in the South. And this would continue for quite a long time, especially during the most industrially formative years of the United States. So the South is not doing well economically. The Great Depression hits it the hardest because the South is also one of the more agrarian areas in the United States, barring just the Great Plains in general. This might not sound significant because you might think, well, everyone was hurt by the Great Depression. The thing about farmers, though, is that they had their own Great Depression start basically after World War I ended, just because during the war and right beforehand, during America's intervention into the war and right beforehand, the farmers were propped up by a lot of government intervention. There was a lot of food to sell to outside powers. If you were a farmer in the United States between the years 1914 to 1918, you were probably doing very well. 1914 to 1917, basically all of Europe needed to import food or smuggle in food. The former is profitable, but the latter is definitely profitable, because if you are smuggling in supplies or resources for a power that is being cut off, you can charge quite a lot more. And that's what some people did. It's not, by no means is it the rule. There wasn't some giant fleet of resource smugglers into Germany, but it did exist in some places, oftentimes an overlooked fact. And then whenever America starts to intervene in the war, you get sort of these, you get a sort of federal rationing agency led by Herbert Hoover himself, that's designed to make sure that if America is going to intervene across the ocean, then America is going to need, apt resources, apt food supplies, all these other things. So this guarantees basically that the farmers, for the duration of America's intervention, would have a steady job that is definitely needed, and because of the nature of state employment and assistance, would probably be just a little bit overpaid. And then you also have the natural consequences. If there is this stability and guarantee in farming, then more people are going to enter, more people are going to go into debt, because they think they can make a profit off of this, pay off the debt, and make money. And that's what a lot of people did. Come 1919, whenever everyone starts coming home from Europe, suddenly that guarantee went away. The investment looks absolutely terrible. The U.S. government no longer needs your farming equipment, labor, food, all of your output. So basically, the farming sector is in dire straits from 1919 until about 1941 or so, 1945, just to be safe if you want to dispute that. So FDR, during that entire time frame, from 1932 all the way until the end of his term in 1944 or 45, I forget which one, basically until he had a stroke and passed, he would draw upon this large section of Southern farmers. They tended to be much more conservative, and basically up until then hadn't really had an official position on state welfare, just because it was never a major political issue in the South or the Great Plains or anything like that. So if you are FDR, what you're looking at is you have sort of these budding social progressives in the North, specifically the Northeast, where a lot of your Democratic elites reside. Some of them will be Roman Catholics. You have this conservative support base in the South that are poor and by political measures very easy to offer social assistance to. This is going to be one part of your coalition that you have to balance against the social progressives. We'll get on to how that worked out in the end. And then also in the West Coast and in the Great Plains. In the West Coast, you have sort of Republican business elites. The Republicans at this time could basically be described as centrist. You had a few nationalists. The Tafts might come to mind. But for the vast majority of their support base and their lower level supporters, they basically just went with what the social standard was at the time. So a lot of Republicans opposed immigration, supported the immigration quotas, were probably somewhat protectionist, but they weren't autarkic, nor were they free trade. They were sort of in this middle ground. For the Democrats on the West Coast, this Republican platform usually was more popular than, sort of social progressivism coming from the far East Coast, and then social welfare being promised to the poorer areas in the heartlands. If you're in the West Coast, the Great Depression did reach you, and it was bad, but the attitude and the severity was much different than the rest of the country. And this results in the Democrats in the West Coast, for at least a little bit, are going to be more conservative than, say, the ones in the Northeast. And then also the Republicans over there are basically going to be not hit as hard as they were in the rest of the country. In the Great Plains, it was basically just filled with farmers. It was not nearly as populated as it is today, which means it's basically going to flip to whoever the most popular candidate is, which is what happened. There's more nuance there, but I'm tired of giving the intro here. So Roosevelt builds this coalition. The main things that you need to know, though, the main centers of power are going to be in the Northeast, which is the more progressive side of things, and the South, the American South, which is going to be the more conservative side of things that are along in the coalition for two reasons. One, it's not Republican, and two, because they are being promised for the first time, basically after the Civil War, that the federal government will stop hurting them and will actually start developing them and helping them economically. Whether or not they actually would or what the actual effects were is immaterial. This is just what they were promised. As time would go on, Roosevelt would start to show his more socially progressive side of things, which would start to alienate parts of the South. And a lot of its, so too with a lot of its influencers and celebrities. Father Charles Coughlin, who was mentioned earlier, would basically be deplatformed. His radio station would, he would be banned from broadcasting on radio. The sort of, if anyone that has a sort of a latent constitutionalist bent in them would probably ask, but what about the First Amendment? To where the immediate response would be, well, this is FDR. Amendments don't quite matter. He did basically just rule as a tyrant, at least from my admittedly biased perspective. So your more conservative figure for this more populist side of things, Coughlin himself, of course, was not a Southern conservative, but he did represent sort of like the more conservative Catholic side of things. He's just one example. The other Southern conservatives would start to grow weary at the fact that FDR had a lot of people surrounding his administration that looked either very socialistic or that looked very much against segregation. Because this is also around the time where a reaction to the status quo of segregation, federally segregating the government, segregating the armed forces and all this other stuff, would develop its own reaction. So whenever you look at these, at the effects of Wilson and the more sort of segregationist progressives earlier on, a few decades beforehand, the reaction really starts to come home here. FDR and Truman both, Truman being the vice president before FDR dies, they would both surround themselves basically with almost exclusively with the socially progressive sides of the Democratic Party. And you can even see this by the fact that Truman was selected as vice president basically halfway through FDR's reign. Because beforehand, FDR's vice president, if I'm remembering correctly, was John Nance Garner of Texas. Garner, FDR's former political ally, was sort of seen as the other side of this Democratic coalition, much more conservative, but still for some amounts of welfare to help the country, the rhetoric. They did not get along at all. And this would make sense because FDR is not really what comes to mind when you think of Southern Democrat, even at this time before it's really a formalized entity. Garner is probably closer to them, though not all the way. So he basically gets kicked to the road. Truman is eventually selected. Truman himself is very interesting. If I remember correctly, he would be a Missourian, but that's not necessarily the thing that matters. Just something that might interest the audience. He worked as an actual Shabbos goy earlier on in his life, which should tell you exactly what's happening there. And then if you look at FDR's Supreme Court appointments, this is what really got the South on edge. Basically, all of FDR's Supreme Court appointments, short of threats of court packing and all this other stuff, were of a certain ethnic character. And this itself is not the issue for most Southerners, just for the simple fact that you would have Sephardic Jews that integrated very well in the South. If you look in the Southern Confederacy, 1861 to 65, Sephardic Jews would fill a lot of the governmental positions, just as an example. With FDR Supreme Court appointments, however, what you're looking at is the most progressive sides of that ethnic group. And this would later, if you know anything about integration, which we will get to in a minute, because we're about to start looking at the party platforms, you will know that the Warren Court in the 50s is what's going to push a lot of this stuff from the legal side. It would be the Warren Court that decides Brown v. Board of Education, if I remember correctly. So that Warren Court wasn't just suddenly all the WASPs flipped to very progressive and integrationist, warm, happy fuzzies. They were replaced off the court, if you will. So the South is thoroughly on edge. Hopefully you guys get the picture. FDR dies. Truman takes power. You're entering what's going to be the 1948 election. And just to make sure, because I don't too terribly want to mislead everyone, I believe this is going to be the election where it is Harry Truman versus Thomas E. Dewey. Could be wrong, though, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. Dewey would have been I believe it would be third-time Republican nominee, lost every single time. This would be the election where Dewey was predicted to win, and didn't. Quite famously, there were a lot of newspapers that printed Dewey wins election and all this other stuff right beforehand, and never came to pass. And you get the famous picture of Harry Truman holding up a newspaper that says Thomas Dewey is supposed to win, pointing at it and laughing. It was a good propaganda victory for the Truman administration. However, this isn't helping the South at all, because Dewey was sort of seen as the moderate side of the Republican Party. Wouldn't be too extremely radical in overturning everything FDR did. He was already kind of cemented in popular consciousness as a necessary political force. But he also wasn't going to, staff his whole administration with progressives. So he was sort of seen as like the peacemaker statesman, despite the fact that he was never actually successful. Truman, on the other hand, was rather progressive. This is the guy that desegregated the army, if memory serves me correctly. And basically, there's going to be a couple points thereafter that are a bit more minor, but this is the last straw for the Southern Democrats. And a lot of their people will meet in Oklahoma City on August 14th, 1948. The link I sent to this should be earlier up in the chat. This is actually a very short party platform. There's only 9 points, not a few signers. So, the Oklahoma City Convention, 1948. What did the first formal Dixiecrats actually believe? What is their convention? So, point 1, we believe that the Constitution of the United States is the greatest charter of human liberty ever conceived by the mind of man. So, this already might seem a bit strange, because a lot of people sort of in our political spheres nowadays make the Dixiecrats out to be ultra-reactionary conservatives. Earlier on, though, and throughout the whole thing, they will always keep the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the concept of liberty at their core, at least in their rhetoric. And this is because if you look at what they're trying to defend, they're not necessarily trying to reinstitute slavery or go to the Articles of Confederation or the Southern Confederacy. What they're trying to do really is to preserve the sort of post-Wilsonite progressive order, where you get this sort of combination of WASP aspiration for liberty, while also maintaining things like segregation in the laws itself. So, and then there's also the more realist aspect of this. You basically have to say this, especially in 1948, if you are going to get somewhere. Because if you just go out as a sort of a third party and all you do is criticize the United States and its founding principle, you are going to be hated. So the more Teddy Roosevelt's progressive faction would basically say the same thing about the Constitution. Their only difference would be they would highlight some of the faults or how it might have been misinterpreted or something like that, so that they would have the free purchase to intervene with its famous trust-busting regulation, all this other stuff to protect the liberty of the small business, of the small man against giant corporations. The Dixiecrats here will also affirm the Constitution of the United States as being the greatest charter of human liberty ever conceived by the mind of man. So that's something to keep in mind for the Dixiecratic character. And then you can make the exact, if you look back at the War of Secession in 1861, a lot of pronouncements of secession also claim this as well, defending the Constitution against unjust amendment and or just completely trampling over it by the North, if you will. So that's point one. So point two is they're building up their sort of logical foundation here. We oppose all efforts to invade or destroy the rights guaranteed by it to every citizen of the Republic. So, elaborating on point one, they were not just defending the Constitution as it was at this time in 48, just for simple rhetorical purposes or even necessarily out of a genuine love for it. It also really helps them to defend their political position. And you can take a realist position on this. If you're in the South, you have to basically support segregation to get elected at this time. But also, that's not entirely true. You did get some people that were not as segregationists, get elected. But in the laws of the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and the precedents handed down by the Supreme Court by this time, 1948, segregation was still legal, and you did not yet have the sort of 14th Amendment ban, just universal ban on segregation everywhere down to businesses. And what civil rights acts that you did have did not ban segregation either. So the Dixiecrats here are basically drawing upon established power for obvious reasons. The law was still nominally on their side. It's just the people executing and carrying out the law were not. So that's your point two. Point three, we stand for social and economic justice, which we believe can be guaranteed to all citizens only by a strict adherence to our Constitution and the avoidance of any invasion or destruction of the constitutional rights of the states and individuals. We oppose the totalitarian, centralized bureaucratic government and the police nation called for by the platforms adopted by the Democratic and Republican conventions. So we'll get to these in a second. But this is a reaction to the Republicans and the Democrats in 1948. But this part at the beginning is vital. It goes to show what I tried to highlight in the introduction here. They aren't opposing, welfare, the welfare state, if you're from the more libertarian-leaning side of things. They are also not really opposing social progressivism entirely. They're just claiming that they are the real moral position to take. So they would claim that strict and actual social justice is making sure that communities are well cared for, being separate, allowed to exist. They have actual defining lines to them. They have strict standards so that they don't just become dissolved or atomized. It's that sort of older form of social justice. And I believe our guest is finally here. Welcome, Mr. Christopher Sandbach. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Alrighty. You're a bit quiet on my end.
You hear me, though?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. All right, we're good. I've got this weird thing's going on with my microphone where it will not show the little three dots that indicate that I'm talking. So,
alrighty.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I actually don't even know that my microphone is the one. You could be picking me up from some random device that's somewhere else in my room that's plugged in. So this may be what you've got to work with. I apologize for being late. I can't get anything right anymore. I wasn't even doing anything last night. I went to sleep at like 9 o'clock. I was like in a Twitter thread, and then I fell asleep like with like that awful blue bird on my face. And then I woke up, at 10 after 8. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's fine. I just figured if you weren't going to show up, I'd just go over like platforms and give sort of background as to what was happening. But
Sandbach is dead. We're going to talk about social justice and how it may have killed him. All right.
So. To catch you up, basically, I gave the sort of a prelude, what was FDR, just the very basics of what was FDR's political coalition, how was the Democratic and Republican parties up to FDR, and, why did the Dixiecrats sort of split in 48? We were about to get to that last explanation, but I figured I'd just outline what they were supporting first. It's just 9 points.
Okay.
The Oklahoma City
yeah.
Convention.
The Oklahoma City. So this is the beginning of the formal Dixiecrat coalition.
Yes.
Which, this is one of these things that I don't want to interrupt you. Finish what you were saying first.
All right. But basically, I was just on point 3. They were basically drawing on established law at this time, just because nominally the law still supported their positions, which is why you can see in point 3, they're arguing for everything that is actually guaranteed by the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and everything to states and individuals. The emphasis on the states there is why they will get their name the States' Rights Democratic Party, because the legal interpretation and political interpretation was that the social progressivism from the more progressive side of the Democratic coalition was basically trampling on the established rights of states to determine their own laws, basically where the federal government will leave out its rightfully obtained right to intervene. So things like segregation at this time was seen as a matter to states, which didn't set well with the more progressive element of the coalition, but it's what the Dixiecrats were trying to defend. Any objections there, Mr. Sandbach? I can ask you that now that you're finally here.
Yeah, no. That's all exactly right. One of the things that I think is worth pointing out is that these Dixiecrats this is a coalition that formally hardens, really after World War II, but they have been a part of American political life since the year 1800. Okay,
right.
So this is actually an ancient political structure that I don't know if you've read this book. Are you familiar with the historian Niall Ferguson?
Yes.
He's that British fellow that married an African woman.
Yes.
But he's got an excellent book.
Ooh. You just cut out for me, Mr. Sandbach. That doesn't bode well. Well, ladies and gentlemen, provided you can still hear me, we had Mr. Christopher Sandbach for a moment. That is quite unfortunate. Give me a moment, just because I'm also don't want to lose my voice too terribly, because I've been talking for about half an hour. I will see if I can get this sorted out with Mr. Sandbach, if you will forgive this, and hopefully in post this will be just edited out. Yeah, there we go. So, in Mr. Sandbach's defense, he is using swamp infrastructure as the joke that commonly gets thrown around. I have no clue where he was going with that point, which is the unfortunate thing, and also why he was here is because he can provide a perspective that I do not know off the top of my head, or necessarily even by academic scholarship. So I can't even fill in what he was going to say there. I don't think it would be too terribly beaten up, though, just by the fact that, I can probably carry on his line of thought he was talking about, the sort of the origin of the Dixiecrats going back to 1800 is a concept in American history called sectionalism. Basically, in the early American Republic, and I could have included this in the intro, but I figured, 25 minutes right off the bat was probably long enough for most people. So Sandbach has gotten back to me saying his internet is patchy, but anyways, to extend further on that line of reasoning, sectionalism in the early American Republic, what does it mean? Well, if you look at the early American Republic along the eastern along the eastern coast, sort of trying to push west into the what would now be known as the Midwest, and further into the South, like Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The geography is very different. So is the natural resources. This means that if you want to have a plantation in like Massachusetts or something, it might have been good early on, when you were just getting there, when laws were different, when people and cultures were different. But no longer as viable as time goes on, especially by the time the century turns to 1800. What this means is the South will increasingly start to rely on things like the plantation system. The North will start to industrialize as it is more profitable, and you will get this as a result of natural resources, culture, religion, whatever not else you want to explain it with. You will get these sections of the United States that are different economically and eventually culturally. And I will hopefully, I haven't gone too far astray from Mr. Sandbatch's point here. Mr. Sandbatch, welcome back.
No, yeah, not at all. Sorry about that. My neighbor's watching college football, which means I get no reception in Bumbletucky, Louisiana. You didn't have to watching college football, watching the pre-game for college football, which is of course a very southern Democrat.
Oh no. Oh no. Are you still there? That is quite unfortunate. Just for the sake of not having dead air, since everyone's minds are dopamine addicted and fried. Hopefully I'll carry on with the point, and for Mr. Sandbatch, hopefully everything sorts itself out, and I will just stop talking as soon as he resumes. Dang, that is really unfortunate. So, with the sections in the American economy and culture brought about by those different geographical, cultural, and religious conditions, the South will become its own distinct entity, and you can divide that up into subsections. But the thing that unites the South as a section is the fact that it relied on plantation labor. For the most part, it was either going to be Southern Baptist or Anglican or Episcopalian as the American Republic breaks off. Sandbatch says he's getting annoyed. I don't blame him at all. But with the sections, South relies on plantation labor. The North will start to industrialize. And this is also going to lead to the basically the Whigs becoming the more economically protectionist side of things, because it's not just ideology. The Whigs were playing specifically to the northern, more industrial sections of the economy, and therefore the economic philosophy goes, you need to protect that in order to develop it as much as possible. The South would be more export-oriented and import-oriented. For hopefully the import should be obvious there. They're going to be much more sort of free trade, not necessarily as an ideological conviction, though there were some that had that in their central philosophy, but because that's what their sectional interest was. Mr. Sandbatch, hopefully now we have you. Third time is the charm.
Yeah, am I here?
Yeah, I hear you.
Oh man, this is
quickly impart wisdom before you get up.
It's terrible. I can see it coming like about 5 seconds before it happens, and you'll be able to hear my voice, like, so get this resigned tone. But anyway, yeah, the Dixiecrats really emerge as a distinct American political philosophy in the year 1800. But as I was referring to the Niall Ferguson book, they really form in the early days what Niall Ferguson would call a network, which is distinguishable from a hierarchy in the sense that it is it's
okay. That is hold on. Let's stop sharing and we'll see if that helps the connection there if he rejoins again after this, which hopefully he does. Once again, I still don't quite know the conclusion of the network point, nor am I going to try to surmise it just because I don't have the knowledge, nor am I going to try to be an expert on what I don't know. See if I can help something else here. Whenever he rejoins, I might stop camera and just see if that will help the burden on his end, trying to download that constantly. So we'll carry on with the sectionalism just to prevent dead air and the non-topic. So you get those sort of trade policies. Social policies obviously will be much different. The Northeast and the North in general will be much more ethnically homogenous, bar certain European waves of immigration, Germans and Irish in the 1840s. Italians and Poles in the 1890s. Hopefully, everyone knows sort of like the basic outline of the story. The South, however, is going to be dominated mostly by a set few ethnic groups. You will have the WASPs, which will form its elite and originally was the majority population in most of its areas. You would have, technically, it shows up on the census as Irish, but in reality, it's what you might call Scots-Irish, that is, Northern Irish, has a much larger Scottish heritage, much more Calvinistic than one might think originally upon hearing Irish. And then, of course, you would have the slave and then eventually freed black population. These would be the main ethnic groups in the South, and two of those are compatible, the Scotch-Irish and the sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite. Don't get along perfectly, but it's not the worst thing either. You don't see, like, Scotch-Irish segregation from the WASP elite, at least in law. You might see that somewhat informally rather, in their social standards. But what you do see is legal segregation between the African descended group and the white descended group, or the European descended group, rather. Why is this? Well, the common wisdom at the time went the two groups could not live together because they were so terribly different, and therefore one might have been more violent and the other one might have been much more peacefully oriented. Some might be considered savages that need to be Christianized first and thoroughly Europeanized, sort of like a more civic nationalist take on it that did exist at the time. Others just view them as just completely unsalvageable. I will stop my cam now, and hopefully Mr. Sandbatch will be able to join us for longer than he has. Hello, Mr. Sandbatch.
Right. Yeah, no, it's not you. It's definitely me. This is like the same. I told you a couple of weeks ago, like I upgraded my internet and it got worse. And so like, this is just something I've been dealing with. That's why I really hadn't been like just too antsy to get on streams, because this is exactly the situation I've been afraid was going to happen.
I see.
But yeah, no, go ahead. We'll see how long I last this time.
So as a result of those of the geography, the religion, as I mentioned, the Northeast and the North would tend to be a bit more non-conformist, I believe would be the Anglican term there. They would tend to be much more independently minded. The Calvinists would be Congregationalists rather than Presbyterian aligned. And the Anglicans would not be as dominant in the Northeast and in the Mid-Atlantic as they would be in the South. For obvious reasons, most of the Northeast was founded to get away from the established Anglican Church.
Well, what's interesting is that Anglicans have never really formed a political bloc in America. Even amongst the Dixiecrats, you're still going to find way more. It's going to be more Presbyterians than anything else. Anglicans, they tend to win the presidency a lot, but are not what you would call a sort of a political theological group that has ever managed to like form. The closest to a base of power actually that the Anglicans form is really in the post-Civil War WASP structure, emergent structure of these people that we call WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And in a weird way, just to skip ahead, skip all the Jefferson shit, because the Dixiecrats don't really become interesting as really interesting in their recognizable political form until after the Civil War, and they're actually the opposition to the WASPs. So really, the WASP power structure becomes located increasingly after the Civil War as the what you would call the Congregationalist churches and the Unitarian Universalist Church declines in the Northeast. All of these groups of people, they'll eventually be called mugwumps, or in the main they're Republicans who sort of soft convert to the Episcopalian Church. It kind of becomes the church of the Northeastern establishment, actually. Now, as you can question how theologically Episcopalian they are. It's a cultural thing as much as it is anything else. They become fixated their Anglo-Saxon heritage, really even to a greater extent than Southern Cavalier sorts do. And the Dixiecrat coalition, especially after the Civil War, when
I thought it was going well that time. Hold on, let me just see if this helps along the process. We'll do that. So that didn't quite fix the issue. He's back. Are you here again? No. Okay. Well, all right. Okay, I kind of think I know where he's going there. The Anglicans never form a power block. Presbyterianism and Southern Baptism also in the South will be the main dominant religious groups. In the Northeast, it's going to be the Congregationalists. You'll have a small Catholic minority as the time goes on. You will have other smaller, more independent Calvinist denominations. That's sort of like the religious demographics you're looking at. He could probably elaborate much more on that than I can, which is the unfortunate part of all this, but we work with what we're dealt with. So with those religious groups there, you can sort of see why there might be different religious sections as time goes on in the United States. The Dixiecrats being obviously the South, originally much more Presbyterian, some of them Anglicans, and then after the Second Great Awakening, Southern Baptists. You would get that sort of main line of groups there. The Northeast, you would have Unitarian Universalists, Congregationalists, a little bit of Catholics, just because if you show up to America as a Roman Catholic, it's going to be in the Northeast in particular, usually. And then as time goes on, you might show up in New York, maybe the Mid-Atlantic, and then whenever you hit modern transportation, it could just be anywhere in the country or over the southern border now that no longer exists. But religiously, those are your sections. We went over the economic parts. Hopefully the cultural part from the two of those can be extrapolated by you, the audience member. But nonetheless, the southern part would go on to give the Dixiecratic philosophy its genesis or its origin. You will see figures coming from the South that will absolutely defend things like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, sort of the early founding American principles, and it's sort of a laissez-faire position on things like political organization and slightly less on economic philosophy, but still more on the laissez-faire side, the non-interventionist side. Just because if you look at the political power structure, the 10th Amendment, provided that the Constitution is interpreted as strictly and as unimplied as possible, as most people from the South would later argue it should have been. Obviously, Hamilton and a lot of the other, I believe it would be constructionists, could be misusing that term though, would argue that the Constitution had implied powers that weren't specifically enumerated. You would get a counter-reaction to that, arguing for the strictest interpretation of the Constitution as possible. If it is not mentioned in there, it isn't in the Constitution, should not be enforced or used. To do so would be to go against the political philosophy. And with the addition of that 10th Amendment at the end of the Bill of Rights, obviously that's an issue left to the states. So here you get sort of like the seed or the genesis of that states' rights in the Democratic Party position. Let me just see. Anyway, sorry. You get that sort of that inkling of states' rights philosophy right at the very beginning of the Republic there, just because of the political structure enumerated in the Constitution, which goes back to that party platform that we were sharing and talking about earlier, where they are just drawing upon constitutional political philosophy. Thankfully, Sandbach gave much more of a coherent beginning than perhaps I did. So you can draw. Sorry, this is the wrong one. You can draw the origin of sort of states' rights, conservatism, if you will, not in the modern sense, but drawing back to an older philosophy that is much more strict, at least socially. You can get that going back to the beginning. So this Dixiecratic strain of thought, you can trace it back to also other figures like John C. Calhoun, I'm sure, is someone you're going to see drawn upon for quite a lot of this. You can get other political philosophers as well. Calhoun is the main one. I would probably be hunted down if I didn't at least mention him once. So that's why they're drawing upon sort of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, because by their interpretation, regardless of any of the things they've even been added on, which at this point had not happened yet, it still supports them. So this is just like the more, legal, like the more original legal side of the interpretation here, formalizing as a party, also playing to the conservatism and just the normal way of doing things in the South of America, and not just the South as well, sort of the mid-Atlantic in parts, reaching into the Midwest and part of the Great Plains, even if it's not enshrined into law, the sort of Southern social standard, at least you can see a lot of parallels. So that's the reason for this point 3 right here, and the preceding 2 points. If Sandbach is gone, I suppose I will carry out the original sort of, ad hoc plan and just keep going through this. Hopefully it will shed light on the issue. Point 4 from the Oklahoma City Convention for the Dixiecrats. We stand for the segregation of the races and the racial integrity of each race, the constitutional right to choose one's associates, to accept private employment without governmental interference, and to earn one's living in any lawful way. We oppose the elimination of segregation and the repeal of miscegenation statutes, the control of private employment by federal bureaucrats called for by the misnamed Civil Rights Program. We favor home rule, local self-government, and a minimum interference with individual rights. So this is sort of the explicit culmination of what I was trying to, of what they were trying to lead you to and what I was trying to explain you to there. Basically, the way that the law works, their political philosophy, the culture in the South and most of the United States held up what they just enumerated there. And the progressive wing of the Democratic Party that we talked about earlier in the stream was opposing all of this. They viewed the fact that there were local laws against individual actions as a prohibition on individual liberty. The Dixiecratic strain of things would view these sort of local laws as the obvious conclusion of local autonomy, self-rule, and individual liberty. With that, Sandbach is back. We will hope for the best. Mr. Sandbach immediately left. Hold on. I think that might have been an accident because I actually heard noise there. But we'll keep carrying on. Hopefully that will sort itself out in a second. But anyways, that sort of you get that dispute over what does liberty mean, and you can trace that back basically to the beginning of the sectionalizing of the United States. So that point number 4 basically is going to be what most people think of when they think of Dixiecrats. In the modern interpretation, the modern historiography, this just gets misconstrued as, well, they were evil racists that hated everyone. And, that could be true for some of them. I don't know about the evil part necessarily. I'm not here to make godly moral judgments. But, some of them could have just disliked all the different ethnic groups that lived in the South. But there is a legitimate sort of legal interpretation here that would later be articulated poorly, granted, but it would be articulated later by people like Barry Goldwater. But since he was a more mainstream Republican, he would leave out such he wouldn't go all in and say we oppose the elimination of segregation and the repeal of miscegenation statutes. He would more argue against the sort of federalization of employment laws and against civil rights acts. He would have a negative vision towards the civil rights regime. It did not work very well at all. So, pressing forward, hopefully Mr. Sandbach will eventually join us soon. Point 5, and there's only 9 points, so we're almost done with this document. The Dixiecrats say, we oppose and condemn the action of the Democratic Convention in sponsoring a civil rights program calling for the elimination of segregation, social equality by federal fiat, regulations on private employment practices, voting, and local law enforcement. So if you remember back to the beginning, when we were talking about the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, Truman, I mentioned, staffed himself with progressives. This would be enshrined in the 1948 Democratic Convention, the sort of democratic progressivism. They basically took over the party, and it would eventually culminate in the 68 Democratic Convention, as most people are aware of, where they would get rid of the old party structure that was seen as much too aristocratic and undemocratic, potentially ironically or hilariously, and substitute it with just full democracy and social progressivism. This is the direct response and basically the formal separation from the mainstream Democrats. So, basically just restating everything that we've talked about so far and some things that they've talked about as well. Point number 6, this one right here on the screen, if you can still see. We affirm that the effective enforcement of such a program would be utterly destructive of the social, economic, and political life of the Southern people and of other localities in which there may be differences in race, creed, or national origin in appreciable numbers. So, this is where we start seeing the more sectarian flavor of the Dixiecratic Party. Obviously, Dixie, the South, you're not going to get away from that. But in the actual name, the States' Rights Democratic Party, that is technically a universal name. There is nothing Southern about that except an implication and connotation. With this right here, though, they are explicitly stating in their manifesto, basically, that the South is their main group that they are looking towards. Which, fair enough, that's probably the most politically expedient thing to do. That's the only place where they are realistically likely to have popular support, especially given their constraints on resources. But what you see here is something that most historians, the modern historical orthodoxy, forgets. They include other localities and realize that this problem exists outside of the South in the United States. So while this is dominated by Southerners, while it is very Southern in origin, while that is where the popular support of this lies, though while this is a Southern legal philosophy, they could see at the time, and we can see it looking back, that the problems they're pointing out aren't just in the South. You could probably just as equally find this in Michigan, given the Great Migration northward by the black ethnicity leaving the South. You could probably see this in places like Maryland, New York, where you had larger Eastern European ethnic groups that immigrated in large numbers. This is they're touching at something that is actually real in American political philosophy and in American political problems. These sort of extreme differences in large numbers in the population. So there's a reason that the United States sort of worked for as long as it did. Is because it allowed these people to be their own separate groups while still keeping a country together for the most part, bar one obvious incident. Whenever you get rid of all this and demand strict conformity and uniform beliefs, regulating employment so that you can no longer have your own ethnic group employed at your place, regulating who you can exclude from your shops, regulating local prohibitions and social convention on marriage, regulating just social segregation in general. This had been happening by every single ethnic group, Native American, Black, Eastern European, Western European, Northern European, basically since they get on the shores, either by law or by natural occurrence. If you suddenly try to get rid of this, you are left with the social positions that we have today. You can kind of see this as an implicit prediction that things will go bad if civil rights does win out in the end. And they were, of course, right in this implicit assumption. So that's point number 6. Point number 7 of the Dixiecratic Party platform, we stand for the check and balances provided by the 3 departments of our government. We oppose the usurpation of legislative functions by the executive and judicial departments. We unreservedly condemn the effort to establish in the United States a police nation that would destroy the last vestige of liberty enjoyed by a citizen. So, let's break this down here and actually analyze what they're saying. So the Dixiecrats say they stand for checks and balances, and they oppose basically the different parts of government flipping their roles or trying to usurp the roles of others. What does this even mean? So the issue here, as we alluded to in the intro, was that the judicial branch basically and the executive branch would try to force social progressivism by either judicial fiat or by executive order. The executive order happened with the desegregation of the military. Technically, that is legal, at least under an interpretation, because the executive branch, the president, controls the military as the commander-in-chief. But there was also the issue that, if I remember correctly, I think he also did this for the National Guard, but that could have been something else, or that could just be completely wrong. But there was a push from the executive branch to desegregate every sort of militaristic apparatus in the United States, not just including the armed forces themselves, but the push also reached like the military industry. It reached the National Guards, which is why you can see the South that sort of opposed this had a more conservative National Guard for a longer time than the North did. Maybe it still does to this day, but you got that push there in the North that you didn't get in the South. And then you also get the judicial branch, basically in 1948, not quite at its most progressive, socially progressive climax, really. It will get more progressive, especially in the 60s and 70s. But the Southerners can see what's coming. Anyone that could look at the Supreme Court in 1948 can see what's coming. So you see this potential that the Supreme Court will just start legislating outside of its powers integration. They will start striking down miscegenation statutes. They will start doing all of these things that the South opposes. That's what this first sentence here is about. The next one. We unreservedly condemn the effort to establish the U.S. as a police nation. What on earth are they talking about? This is your typical rhetoric that to enforce all of these things, you're going to need some form of military occupation. Here you see the Southerners are predicting that if you oppose this sort of civil rights regime, or if you just try to implement it at all, from either side there, opposition being the receiving end, the imposition being the imposing end, you're going to have to use the military or the police in some way. This will, of course, sticking with that sort of as earlier stated, constitutional grounding. This might seem very reminiscent of redcoats and houses. How are you going to make sure that no business segregates? Well, you basically have to have a policeman in there. You have to have informants. You might have to mobilize the National Guards, or all these other things. That's the worry here. And you can see this in the modern day. This prediction here, this implicit prediction, did eventually come true. So it's not like they were just speaking out of nowhere. All right. We have 2 more points. After I get to point 9, if Sandbach still has not arrived and the issue is not sorted out, I will unfortunately have to break for about 2 minutes to get water because I did not expect to just speak for who knows how long impromptu. So, point 8. We demand that there be returned to the people to whom of right they belong those powers needed for the preservation of human rights and the discharge of our responsibility as Democrats for human welfare. We oppose a denial of those by political parties, a barter or sale of whose rights by a political convention, as well as any invasion or violation of those rights by the federal government. We call upon all Democrats and upon all other loyal Americans who are opposed to totalitarianism at home and abroad to unite with us and ignominiously, defeating Harry S. Truman, Thomas E. Dewey, and every other candidate for public office who would establish a police nation in the United States of America. So I butchered that slightly, and it's worded very archaically. What on earth are they talking about here? This is basically restating their previous points. Everything that is being pushed for by the sort of progressive Democratic wing and the Republican Party goes against human welfare. It goes against individual political rights. It basically usurps everything and puts it in the hands of the federal government, and they will enforce it by police and by army. So this point 8 here is just a call to action in much more classical terms, much more flowery diction for the sort of conservative wing of the Southern and more broadly the American people to oppose the two parties. And then finally, point 9. We therefore urge that this convention endorse the candidacies of J. Strom Thurmond and Fielding H. Wright for the president and vice president, respectively, of the United States of America. So that's your states' rights Democratic Party. They were behind Strom Thurmond, the famous senator who only retired, I think, in the 2000s. He had a very, very long political life. Quite famously, he gave the longest filibuster in American history, if memory serves. It was over 24 hours, where he read through to filibuster the Civil Rights Act, the one that everyone knows and loves, quote unquote. He filibustered that for 24 hours by reading out all of the election laws of the states of the United States, word for word, drawing upon various different legal documents in United States history. If you go read through it, it's not actually just it's not like time wasting like you might imagine a filibuster. He is actually making a 24-hour point just in the most sort of backed up and supported way possible by reading through each law on the books of all 50 states, and basically saying that the Civil Rights Act is not it's not going to change anything because the laws are already there. This is for something more sinister. That's what his filibuster is about. Basically, this predates that filibuster. He's sort of younger, not as established as he would be, and they're endorsing him for president. And there's a bunch of reasons. If Sam Batch were here, he could probably go into the personal traits of each of them. And then you get some fancy names here that signed off at the end. William H. Murray, that is Alfalfa Bill Murray. You might know him for being the governor of Oklahoma, famously tried to declare war on Texas. If you're a nerd and play video games, he appears in a few Hearts of Iron 4 mods. But much more importantly, he was sort of like the conservative opposition to the FDR regime, especially when FDR was first seeking election. William H. Murray positioned himself to basically be the conservative force in the Democratic Party. It did not work that way, but he did have a very interesting campaign where he famously opposed the 3 C's, which was corporations, carpetbaggers, and a racial slur for for a specific ethnic group, which you might be able to surmise. Corporations itself might have been a euphemism, who knows? You also get other names here like Haskell. If you know your political dynasties and all the other things that might go into that, Haskell might be a name that you recognize. And then you basically get the sort of bureaucratic mentions here at the end of the formula. So this is the Dixiecratic Party platform. This is what they themselves are saying they believe. Quite famously, though, they only won, I think it was either 3 or 4 states in the Deep South. I believe it was South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, but I could be misremembering. But I think that that's the only states that the Dixiecrats carried in the 48 election. Harry S. Truman obviously won re-election. Thomas Dewey lost quite humiliatingly for the 3rd time. So that's where we're starting. And I have the other 48 platforms pulled up. We're not going to read through them because they're gigantic. They're like a actual manifesto. But we will just contrast them in about 2 minutes after I go back and get water. And who knows, maybe even Sandbatch will be back in that time. But we'll give a recess for 2 minutes, and I will be back either before or during then. It will be 9:11 a.m. My time, so I will be back shortly. Alrighty. So I am back early, but we'll give it another minute just in case people actually took the full 2 minutes to leave. But yeah, hopefully I can make it for the whole stream now. It's quite difficult to kind of just get out of bed and start talking for an hour. Kind of impromptu as well, being as the original plan was just to talk with Mr. Sandbatch. This is all something that I came up with in about 15 minutes this morning, so hopefully it's providing for the topic well. But we'll give it about 30 more seconds or so, because we can go through the sort of other 1948 conventions here, just to kind of see what the Dixiecrats were railing at. What is the big issue that what is this police state that's actually going to come to pass? Well, we'll see here. So just a few more seconds. I'm going to make sure my voice doesn't give out. So how is everything going in the chat there? Is this everything up to standard? Hopefully, audio sound all right. How's everything going? No spam bots, hopefully. We'll wait for that delay to pass through, and hopefully by the time that you all mention, maybe not. Well, you'll mention it eventually, but either way, the time that I allotted myself has passed. We'll continue on. This is the 1948 Democratic Party Convention. As you might be able to see, it is much more comprehensive and expansive than the 9-point manifesto that we just went through. So there's a lot in here. There's a lot of things on foreign policy. If you remember what we just went through, the Dixiecratic Party platform did not touch on foreign policy. It didn't really touch on specific policy either. It didn't really talk about specific acts they wanted passed. It didn't talk about schooling policy. It didn't talk about actual what is their welfare policy. They just said they like welfare, and then human welfare as well, which isn't the same thing as like monetary welfare. So, it's not a full-form platform that you might think. It's more of a manifesto, a declaration of intent, if you will. They're going to go against the Democrats. So, what are the Democrats saying in 48 that was so terrible and eventually won Truman the election, despite the fact that Dewey was just apparently unelectable? They have this whole section here. Basically, Truman it talks about economic issues first. They're going to enforce antitrust laws with adequate appropriations. Vague. Who on earth knows what that means exactly? Well, we found out eventually. You would get absolutely terrible antitrust cases. You would get an attempted nationalization of a whole industry to prevent unions, which may not sound like an antitrust issue until you realize that the Sherman Antitrust Act was written against unions originally and was later turned on corporations. So, but anyways, they're talking about economics. They're talking about the right to free enterprise and the right of all persons to work together in cooperatives and democratic associations. You don't want anything that sounds bad in these political formulas. But at the end of this economic section right here, we get. Actually, I'll just read the whole thing, because it sort of transitions. It's a segue, if you will. We support the right of free enterprise and the right of all persons to work together in cooperatives and other democratic associations for the purpose of carrying out any proper business operations, free from any arbitrary and discriminatory restrictions. Now, so most sane, normal people would see, the right to free enterprise as being directly contradictory to, completely banning, arbitrary and discriminatory restrictions. This is where they start going off the rails in their manifesto, at least for the Dixiecrats. Because here, what is an arbitrary restriction in hiring and working in a business? I mean, that seems rather subjective, you might say, not to use a potentially poisoned term. You know, to like a nonprofit, you know, actual income past a certain point might just be arbitrary. Just because for certain nonprofits, you know, they will oftentimes you're not allowed to make a profit, as is in the name. So you have to get rid of that money somehow. Sometimes there's just not a good way to do that. So they start to, just the way they start viewing things is income might be seen as arbitrary. I don't know if that was a legal distinction at this time, but it's just one example. You know, the very core of a business, revenue, profit, can in some cases be seen as arbitrary. Or if it's just an entrepreneur founding a business that's just turning loss after loss, but it's for, you know, psychic profit, the entrepreneur likes doing what he's doing, you know, in that case as well, profits are arbitrary, and to a certain point. What this really is a thinly veiled attack, of course, on you know, segregation, which is what the Dixiecrats saw it to be, and it's what it turned out to be. Because to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, hiring or firing based on race or racial restrictions was seen to be an arbitrary thing, because they were already buying into this sort of racial egalitarianism. And then discriminatory restrictions should just sort of underscore that point. They're completely coming after workforce segregation. One moment. So we get this transition from this economic program where they're just saying all these warm, happy, fuzzy things. And then suddenly they sneak this in on their conservative Democratic coalition. You know, by the way, we're going to start attacking your way of life. And then they continue in the next point right here. Oh, and I suppose I could put the link to this into the chat for people to follow along. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. So this point right here. The Democratic Party is responsible for the great civil rights gains made in recent years in eliminating unfair and illegal discrimination based on race, creed, or color. So they're already pulling this on their southern wing. They don't care, obviously. They have control of the party, and they think they have control of the electorate. They have control of what they think to be the elites. And to be fair, they did. They ended up winning. The Dixiecrats did not carry all the states that they thought they would, nor did they really make an actual impact on policy or on the enforcement of policy. So we'll keep going just to underscore the point. The Democratic Party commits itself to continuing its efforts to eradicate all racial, religious, and economic discrimination. This might seem apt in the modern day, and you have to keep in mind this was 1948. And they are saying all racial, religious, and economic discrimination. You know, not unjust discrimination or something like that, which itself would be tenuous, but at least makes more logical sense from there in the perceived position. No, they're eliminating all discrimination. They want full equality. So this is a major break from previous Democratic policy. You know, they mentioned civil rights gains and all this other stuff. There had been other civil rights acts passed before '64, you know, the big famous one, even going back to the Reconstruction era. But there were none really that eliminated all racial, religious, and economic discrimination. This is insane. And here at the end as well, economic discrimination. If you remember a lot of the rhetoric of the Dixiecrats, a lot of it would go to say we were unfairly occupied and discriminated against economically, and that impoverished the South. So this might even seem to the unsuspecting viewer or reader like they're throwing a bone to the Dixiecrats in the middle of attacking their way of life. But no, this is economic discrimination for the people against the Dixiecrats, not the Dixiecrats themselves. They get to be on the bottom rung here. They don't get any of their needs really cared for. So, and just to underscore all of this, this is the last declarations, and then they go into details, which we'll skip for now. I think you guys get the idea. We again state our belief that racial and religious minorities must have the right to live, the right to work, the right to vote, the full and equal protection of the laws on a basis of equality with all citizens as guaranteed by the Constitution. We highly commend President Harry S. Truman for his courageous stand on the issue of civil rights. So this is just the complete declaration of I don't want to say extermination because that's too harsh and perhaps too flashy of a word. But this is the 1948 Democratic Party that still has half of it taken by a conservative wing. Basically, the progressives are just saying here, we're going to destroy your way of life by law. And not only are we going to do that, we're going to celebrate it. And Harry S. Truman, the supposedly midway, somewhat conservative, somewhat progressive Democrat, has also just completely flipped colors and is now pushing the progressive agenda. So if you think back to the Dixiecratic Party platform that we just went over, suddenly their concerns are much more applicable. And, what was that police state thing that they were going on about? Well, you have to enforce all of this somehow. And something else that was less egregious to the Dixiecrats that I forgot to mention is this is also where the the Democratic Party, the Progressive Democratic Party in the Northeast, in the North Atlantic, starts vowing for, they quote, "We recommend to Congress the submission of a constitutional amendment on equal rights for women." So not only are they pushing for racial equality, they're also pushing for sexual equality for women in political terms. This is 1948, by the way. A lot of people, even on our side in our historiography, basically just say that, the Democratic Party really starts going wrong with, you can either say FDR or Kennedy and LBJ. They're pushing for stuff that is even radical by today's standards, a constitutional amendment for equal rights for women. They're pushing for extremely radical positions in 1948 when the country is probably at its second or third most conservative in the last century. One moment here. So this radical wing did exist, and it had the presidency in the form of Harry S. Truman for, I believe it would be either 7 or 8 years, at least until 1952, when Eisenhower would take over and proceed to overturn none of this. So this is what the Dixiecrats were arguing against. And, this is the totalitarianism they're talking about. You have to enforce this in some way. And then, both sides obviously condemn the Republican Party. Their manifesto or their platform is much better laid out just because they divide it into sections, unlike the Democratic Party. But they're giving your typical Republican talking points. Just to give you an idea, just so you can't say I mischaracterized someone, the Republicans themselves say, quote, they have the following principles: maximum voluntary cooperation between citizens and minimum dependence on law. Never, however, declining courageous recourse to law if necessary. So they're basically just taking a middle ground on the dependence of people on law, including welfare, government intervention, and all this other stuff. You get this Republican talking point that has never once gone away in the history of the Republican Party. Administration of government must be economical and effective. So basically, they realize that the law is a bad thing to most extents. People can become over-reliant on it. It will have distortive, perverse effects. And then, 1948, the Republican Party here is talking about, but also when we do have the law, it needs to be distortive and people need to be dependent on it very efficiently and economically. So, you get the typical Republican Party talking point. And then part two, when they're starting to go on their more economic side of things instead of just their base principles. And I'll put this link in the chat so that everyone can follow along right here. You get the part two. They're talking about the Republican Congress, the Republican-controlled Congress under Harry S. Truman, the benefits that it brought. Typical Republican talking points. The budget is balanced. The taxes are reduced. They also, in response to FDR, and this could be shooting themselves in the foot, depending on how you look at it, or it could be a good thing. They prevented another FDR from happening. They limited the presidential tenure to 2 terms. I tend to be a bit more favorable to that just because I don't think that if you are going to have this system, you shouldn't be dying in office because you just didn't get voted out. And then might sound familiar today. The Republicans are promising assistance to veterans and also widows and orphans, sort of on a pension scheme. They're also just promising assistance to agriculture. So nothing has really changed here with the Republican Party since 1948. They're sort of, and here you get sort of like the foreign policy globalism. They're taking credit for the great honor of establishing the United Nations and going along with it. And you still see most of the establishment GOP promising this today. Nothing has really changed since 1948. And you can kind of see what the conservative wing is reacting to. Obviously, this is not really conservative enough. And let me see if I can find it real quick. Yeah, they start quoting Lincoln down here. Basically, they're sort of going into a more militaristic sort of application of equality and justice. If you are following along, you go to section 4, and they start saying, in Lincoln's words, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. So they're basically, in the name of justice and in the name of American values, in the name of defending themselves, they are perfectly willing to discard the old, founding principle of getting out of alliances and staying isolated. Also completely breaking with their party not 2 decades beforehand, which was extremely isolationist. And they're basically just saying we need to reinvent ourselves as the world police. And also so in domestic affairs as well. They are going to be very much more interventionist than they might have looked at beforehand. But in this manifesto, they are going to play it off as if they are the small, non-interventionist party that's here to protect the little guy. They've got rhetoric about small business. Nothing has changed. They're talking about the benefit of collective bargaining. Granted, this is when the GOP was probably much more friendlier to unions, rather. But I haven't really heard the GOP in the modern day speak against collective bargaining. And in fact, if you pressed most of them on it, especially the ones that make your laws, they would probably say something like, "Oh yeah, it's there to make sure that the employer and the employee don't get too much power. This is a good middle ground." So this is their platform, and you can read it more in depth. We're not really focusing on the Republicans today, but that's the state of the game in 1948. Truman goes on to win. The Dixiecrats carry those few states in the South, and overall, as you might well know, 1948 to 1952, Truman goes on. He keeps implementing not as radically progressive social and civil rights laws. He tries to famously nationalize the steel industry to prevent a strike, which is probably the more hawkish thing that he did, besides enacting domino theory as the foreign policy and getting involved in Vietnam. So that's the Truman presidency. 1952 to 1960, you will get the Eisenhower presidency. Just kind of zooming along quickly here. One moment. 52 to 1960, you will get the Eisenhower presidency. And we could go through the party platform for 52 and 56, but there's no real point. All that we really need to know, and this will bear out as we go on to discuss things with the 68 election, sort of like the last gasp of the Dixiecrats as a national force. The Eisenhower administration promised to overturn a lot of the more radical policies of the FDR and the Truman administrations, but they never delivered. In fact, they sort of just enshrined these things as the new conservative principle. Social Security would be one that comes to mind. They promised to severely limit it because they viewed it as or at least the Republican establishment that wrote the manifesto and ran Eisenhower's campaign, on top of good general guy is good, so elect him. They would make promises like, well, Social Security is ultimately unsustainable. It's going to be heavily costly. People shouldn't be told by the federal government how to save their money, typical Republican talking points. And they get probably one of the larger electoral mandates that they will ever get in their history with Eisenhower and the resulting Congresses. Someone saying that Truman got involved in Korea, not Indochina. He got involved in both. It was Truman originally that started nominally supporting the French colonial government there. But yes, Korea as well would be another one. But anyways, back to the Eisenhower thing. They would have probably one of the most indisputable electoral mandates for their program, and all they did was end up just cementing the sort of progressive democratic laws into place, in exchange for being able to build a transnational highway. So that's what the Eisenhower administration now is remembered for. Of course, you got a lot of foreign policy wins there, if you want to view it that way. A lot of nuclear arsenal development. Very Cold Warrior, much like the average Republican usually is at this time frame. So that's the Eisenhower administration, and then you get to the Kennedy administration. Pardon me, just for a moment. Alrighty. Hopefully I can carry on for the rest of this. So the Kennedy administration gets elected in 1960. It is seen as much like Truman, as sort of the middle way between the progressive Democrats and the conservative Democrats in the South. However, the South absolutely hated him, at least most of them, Democrat or Republicans. The Republicans hated him because he was promising things like a much higher minimum wage. In the past, JFK had supported things like a universal healthcare system. He had supported just absolutely insane welfare policies that threatened to become much, much more interventionist and social engineering, and was much more socially engineering in nature than previous efforts had been. So the Republicans hated him, and the Democrats in the South hated him because they viewed him as a civil rights-loving integrationist. So everyone knows how his administration ends. He gets assassinated, but something to keep in mind is that because of his assassination, he is often viewed much more favorably and less objectively, or as objectively as you can get in history, than you might be able to view a president that had nothing dramatic happen to him, like, say, Johnson. Dramatic in the sense that he personally was not shot. So Kennedy is viewed with rose-tinted glasses, even by like modern-day conservatives, supposedly. You can find just to represent the mainstream here, you can find videos from PragerU praising Kennedy as a conservative icon because he liked guns and opposed abortion. One moment here. We'll pick up from that train of thought in a minute. Sorry. Anyways, the conservatives hold him up today as a conservative icon just because he held like normal views, and they completely ignore the fact that his brother Robert Kennedy actually once declared John F. Kennedy to be the more radical brother. So this is something that often gets overlooked. And oftentimes, what you'll see a lot of historians today do is they will put the majority of the credit for Johnson's Great Society program into they will credit JFK with writing and coming up with most of the reforms. Just because Johnson didn't suddenly ascend to the presidency and start, basically just come out of thin air every single part of the Great Society. It was comprehensive. It completely radicalized and in some cases nationalized parts of society. You had massive assistance given to select groups of the population to influence their political leanings, to influence their social cohesion. You had great amounts of welfare given to infrastructure development with the assumption that certain parts of the country would become richer than other parts. Everyone knows the story behind the Great Society. If you don't, it might be I remember Academic Agent on his channel. Academic Agent did an overview of the Great Society, though it might be under paywall. But we aren't here to discuss that today. Anyways, Kennedy gets most of the credit for this in the modern day. Johnson, of course, came up with his own parts of it and oftentimes radicalized more of it. He expanded the scope of a lot of things. But the groundwork was there for Johnson after he ascended to just start implementing things. And he was especially able to do that because now most of the country, even where they once hated Kennedy, were behind Johnson as sort of the poor successor to the man that just got unjustly murdered in front of the national public. So he gets to radicalize U.S. society in a scope previously unheard of and perhaps unheard of since. And people just go along with it and love it because Kennedy got shot, to be perfectly blunt. So what happens with this? Johnson quite famously vows that he will not run for re-election, after getting his full one term. He runs for re-election in 1964, but after he basically just wanted the full one term, which he won over Goldwater. Goldwater kind of articulated the original Dixiecratic convention, but without the positive aspect of it. So he was just kind of going in with the negative vision of we want to get rid of the Civil Rights Act, we want to get rid of infringements on liberty and all this other stuff, and didn't really articulate what he actually wanted America to look like, which led to Goldwater being accused with accusations of being a crypto segregationist and all this other stuff and a racist. So stuff that would probably just wash right off of us, but back in 1964, these would be major accusations. So the Great Society will go through. Goldwater loses to Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson pushes through with the most radical aspects of the Great Society, short of making a national healthcare system, which once again, the original push and idea for that goes back to Kennedy himself. Or maybe not like the full infrastructure, but the political support behind it goes back to Kennedy. So whenever we get to 1968, this is when things start to really take off. 1968, Lyndon B. Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, basically takes the Democratic mantle. The Democratic National Convention has its famous turmoil. Robert F. Kennedy gets shot, along with a few other people. There's a lot of conspiracy theories and there's speculation behind how that happened, why it happened. Was the shooter crazy? Was he hypnotized? Who knows? We're not here to speculate on that today. All that we really need to go over is the fact that Hubert Humphrey is he is just a completely uncompromising social progressive that is even too extreme for parts of the progressive elements of American society. And in this 1968 Democratic National Convention, you would also get the drive to democratize the Democratic Party, which in realist terms basically means completely stripping the conservative wings of the Democratic Party and putting them into the hands of the progressive wings. It's just how it realistically ended, and sometimes how it was marketed to people that were supposed to support it. So you get this Democratic Party that has been through turmoil, and the progressive side wins out, but it is not united with the rest of the party. So what happens to the conservative wing if they're basically losing out so terribly here? Well, they split off and they form the American Independent Party in 1968. This would be George C. Wallace, the governor of Alabama, sort of at the head of this, and we can go into why, we can go into the power politics behind this. If Mr. Sandbach was still with us, he could probably give a much better explanation than I ever could for at least the next 30 years. This is just the issues with trying to do stream. We might revisit this topic with Sandbach at a later date. But the conservatives basically just disavowed the Democratic Party, and they formed the American Independent Party in 1968. And we will basically go through different parts of this in one moment. Might be good to take a short speaking break right beforehand, though. Alrighty. So this happens in San Francisco. The American Independent Party, the sort of breakaway Dixiecratic faction of the Democratic Party. This might seem really strange to modern sensibilities because, California is viewed as a very, very progressive state now, especially so places like San Francisco. Not necessarily so in 1968. You can see elements of it tending towards progressivism, but by all means, it's still rather right wing. And California is probably the state in the union where you can find, the most radically right wing and the most radically left wing. So, and that might still even be true today. I don't know. Maybe there's a reaction against the progressivism. But with this 1968 convention, they start off with a preamble, and this is going to be much more poetic than the Dixiecratic convention was for Oklahoma City. The Independent Party says, "A sense of destiny pervades the creation and adoption of this first platform of the American Independent Party, a platform personifying the ideals, hopes, aspirations, and proposals for action of the party and its candidates for the presidency and vice presidency of the United States, George C. Wallace and Curtis E. LeMay. As this great nation searched vainly for leadership while beset by riots, minority group rebellions, domestic disorders, student protests, spiraling living costs, soaring interest rates, a frightening increase in the crime rate, war abroad, and loss of personal liberty at home, while our national political parties and their leaders paid homage to the legions of dissent and disorder and worshipped at the shrine of political expediency, only this party, the American Independent Party, and its candidates George C. Wallace and Curtis E. LeMay, possessed the courage and fortitude to openly propose and advocate to the nation those actions which are necessary to return this country to its accustomed and deserved position of leadership among the community of nations, and to offer hope to our people of some relief from this continued turmoil, frustration, and confusion brought about through the fearful and inept leadership of our national political parties." So that's the beginning of that preamble to the American Independent Party platform. You can read along here. The link should just be posted to the comments, or the live chat rather. So you can read the rest of it. That's sort of what they're going in with. This is no longer a party about, or this is not a movement about legal philosophy and, constitutionalism, as you might have seen in the original Dixiecrats, at least not explicitly. They are not starting off with, we really like the Constitution, its laws, and the judiciary have in the past supported us. Times have changed by 68, coming from 48, the 20 years in between. The laws had been so thoroughly changed that they were thoroughly against the Dixiecrats, as had the judiciary. They had completely ruled against them on every landmark case. So what do we get here? Well, they're not going to be focusing on the legal aspects of it, nor was that where the popular conscience was for the Dixiecrats. Rather, what you get is they're going to be focusing on actual issues and solutions. They're going to be very pragmatically oriented, at least in their diction. So they give off, enumerated things that they like. It's a manifesto or a platform. So basically, they're going to discuss what they are going to be talking about. Unlike the States' Rights Democratic Party, the American Independent Party is actually going to give things like foreign policy. They're going to give a comprehensive domestic policy, and they're going to give economic policy. So we're in for a treat here. What are they saying about domestic policy? Well, they divide everything up into paragraphs. I'm not going to read all of them. Domestic policy is one paragraph, though. We'll go through it. They say, "Clearly, our citizens are deeply concerned over the domestic plight of this nation. Its cities are in decay and turmoil. Its local schools and other institutions stand stripped of their rightful authority. Law enforcement agencies and officers are hampered by arbitrary and unreasonable restrictions imposed by a beguiled judiciary. Crime runs rampant through the nation. Our farmers exist only through unrealistic government subsidies. Welfare rolls and costs soar to astronomical heights. Our great American institutions of learning are in chaos. Living costs rise ever higher, as do taxes. Interest rates are reaching new heights. Disciples of dissent and disorder are rewarded for their disruptive actions at the expense of our law-abiding, God-fearing, hard-working citizenry. America is alarmed that these conditions have come to exist and that our national leadership takes no corrective action. We feel that the programs and policies of our party offer this leadership and provide constructive, or sorry, let me rephrase that. We feel that the programs and policies of our party offer this leadership and provide constructive proposals of action for the elimination of the conditions now existing. This we would do in the following manner. And they basically go draw upon the founders and the Bill of Rights and all that now, not in the core of their philosophy, but rather as something as a supportive measure. And they would just continue to express, basically, they want to go back to the old method of criminal prosecution and arrests and police policy that predated the Civil Rights Act before it was so, in their view, so undeservedly hampered. And just to give you a taste of that, we'll take a couple sentences out of their local government policy. This is the third paragraph of that section. And the American Independent Party says, let me see if I can find the start here. Yeah, this is all just one big ramble. So we'll start in the middle. Basically, they're talking about the injustices of the federal government, and then right in the middle here, the federal government has forced the states to reapportion their legislatures, a prerogative of the states alone. The federal government has attempted to take over and control the seniority and apprenticeship lists of the labor unions. The federal government has adopted so-called civil rights acts, particularly the one adopted in 1964, which have set race against race and class against class, all of which we condemn. It shall be our purpose to take such steps and pursue such courses as may be necessary and required to restore to the states the powers and authority which rightfully belong to the state and local governments, so that each state shall govern and control its internal affairs without interference or domination of the federal government. So that's what they're drawing from here. What they're drawing from here is this sort of American political philosophy of local autonomy, not because of some deeply held conviction of autonomy, but because that is the thing that works the best for such a patchwork of ethnicities and religions and cultures. Something else that's missing from the Dixiecrats that you might see here is they're starting to play on their support in unions. If you don't know about George Wallace's presidential run, he got massive support in the South for the Dixiecrats, obviously for cultural reasons and political heritage reasons. But he also got massive support in the Northeast and in the Midwest because the unions were, supportive of basically everything that they're saying here. The federal government was intervening in the affairs of unions, so that's one strike against the progressives. And then the other one was, if you just start force integrating, that's not great for the mostly European-dominated unions. They're going to oppose integration because they don't want to, they want to protect their own. So, as a result, Wallace got a lot of support in places like Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, just because he was there very explicitly supporting unions. The progressives were perfectly willing to take the support of the unions when they would support them and just throw them under the bus in the name of civil rights integration. So that's what you get to see here. And the Republicans largely stayed united. There was no split in the Republican Party, so they were popular across a lot of the nation. But that's their sort of local governance, domestic policy. You can read the rest of it for yourself. They also get into economic policy, and we get something quite potentially contradictory to a lot of people on our side, but still a breath of fresh air considering that no one in government at least pretends to care about private property anymore. The American Independent Party says, "We hold that the ownership of private property is the right and privilege of every American citizen and is one of the foundational stones upon which this nation and its free enterprise system has been built and has prospered. We feel that private property rights and human rights are inseparable and indivisible. Only in those nations that guarantee the right of ownership of private property as basic and sacred under their law is there any recognition of human rights." So, this might even sound very libertarian, but that's not necessarily the case. This is just American political philosophy. Private property underscored most American political philosophies until socialistic elements got imported in the 1840s. But that's a topic for another time. Pardon me for a moment. So, private property, they have this whole section on it, and basically they are enshrining it into their policy. So, while they do still hold to welfarism, this is George Wallace. He implemented a miniature welfare state in Alabama, for instance. They're not going to be completely progressive. They view it as sort of a unfortunate burden that it has to be done for either political or moral reasons, and not necessarily one that is just good in nature, like a lot of the progressives would view it. They give a whole section on crime and disorder. The preamble hopefully touched on that well enough to where you can you, the audience, knows what they would say about crime and disorder. They have a section on cities and suburbs, and this is interesting, and I think that we should probably read it. The American Independent Party starts this off by saying, quote, "The urban areas of our nation are in a state of social and economic unrest, largely brought about through unfulfilled promises hastily and carelessly made, and in the failure of ill-conceived programs enacted under duress and compulsion. For this, we must hold responsible the national leadership of the other two parties, for they were joint partners in this disastrous course of action, resulting in the situation now existing in our cities." And I'll just keep going because this might seem, no one talks about this section of the American Independent Party or the '68 election. This might sound even dissident right to some people. So, that, or at least that sort of underlying philosophical section. And they get into specifics. "We object to a federal policy which has poured billions of dollars into our cities over the past decades, but which has not been able to prevent their stagnation and decay, and has resulted in the flight of millions to the suburbs. We reject the notion that the solution is untold additional billions to be poured into the cities in the same manner, whether such huge sums are to be raised from taxes on the middle class in general, or by unwelcome taxes on those who live in the suburbs of the individual cities. We submit that no government can buy contentment from those living in the cities, suburbs, or rural areas. We advocate the formulation of a mutually arrived at joint federal, state, and local policy which will make it economically and socially attractive and physically safe for people to live again in all sections of all our cities. We submit that the science and technology which made possible the development and growth of these cities is the instrument whereby this can be brought about." So this is something that never really gets talked about, even by historians. The Dixiecrats actually had a fully fledged domestic policy. And this is one of the issues they pointed at. It's not just cities are bad because of crime. It's also the fact that cities were stagnating and suburbs were developing. And the Dixiecrats did not like this they don't really say it, but a lot of these cities, especially in the early parts of the early quarter of the 1900s, was sort of the flourishing of what you might consider like traditional American culture. It's where the orchestras operated. It's where a lot of like the traditional American businesses, that not the sort of ones that you see nowadays, where you might see profit as the only concern, but ones that cared about quality and craftsmanship and entrepreneurial ability. This is the place where they flourished. When Broadway still had like an actual American tone to it and wasn't the camp of a certain ethnic tribe. This is where it flourished as well. So I might make the same case for Hollywood because I'm not convinced that it was ever necessarily good, bar maybe for a decade or so. But this is the issue. And I believe it was in the American event, I believe it was Closington who spoke about Closington and Charlemagne who spoke about the needs for cities and the sort of untenability of just focusing on the rural life of things. Cities in every civilization are where the culture flourishes. The Dixiecrats, unlike the other two parties and unlike a lot of the right today, realize this and actually have a full policy dedicated to the cities. And then sort of going onwards, playing into this concept of federal welfare, or federalism applied to welfare. They will, basically, to summarize here, they will avow welfare, but only in the case where there's absolutely nothing else providing for the poor. So it's your typical, or not typical, but it's your sort of authentic conservative welfare form if you are going to have welfare. Only have it because no one else can provide, and at the same time, they are providing job opportunities because they view that as a better form rather than just throwing money at people. And just to give a taste of that, in the middle of this section, the Dixiecrats say, or sorry, the Independent Party says, quote, "We would propose that the federal government aid and assist in a well-designed program of job training or retraining for those in need thereof. This will be at the vocational school and lower level, depending on the needs of the trainees. We will encourage and assist the states in programs of job training and retraining through realistic, productive efforts in this respect, including assistance to the establishment and maintenance of vocational trade schools and other like institutions designed to provide skilled and semi-skilled personnel for industrial employment, as well as means whereby in-training programs can be carried out by private industry in cooperation with the government." So, interventionists, sure, their private property libertarian flavor kind of just gets thrown out of the water here. But this is something interesting that you see. Realistically, they're playing to their union power base here. They're basically telling the unions, not only will we directly support you explicitly, but we will also do so implicitly by caring for your workers. We're providing you potentially more people for your union through this job creation program. Also, even though Wallace never won the presidency, nor did he throw the election to the House, we'll get to that in a second, these trade schools did eventually get implemented, or at least become popular by private means, one or the other, depending on the location. And for a lot of smaller towns today, where actual American culture holds out against the sort of urban anti-culture, if you will, the more hostile, cancerous elements that you might see in New York City or San Francisco, these trade schools are what keep a lot of local towns dynamic or alive, if you will. Not the only thing, but they definitely help. It's how a lot of towns can produce their plumbers and carpenters, their mechanics, and all this other stuff. Even like the small town that I came from, we had a very well-ran trade school that a lot of people, well, I don't know if it's well-ran because I never went, but a lot of people seem to go there. My dad went there for a while. It has a long history. And the people that it turns out seem to be pretty well skilled. This program, if you were to have an interventionist program, is probably one of the better ones, and they're advocating for it right here in no uncertain terms. Health and welfare, hopefully you get the idea. We're not going to spend too much time on that, as well as the social services. Now, the national economy. Notice how they haven't really touched on segregation yet, which we'll talk about that in a second. But part of the full platform, we'll get to the national economy. Their first paragraph, the independents say, "The national economy must be restored to and maintained in a healthy, viable posture under conditions assuring to each individual American the opportunity to participate in and enjoy the benefits arising from a real prosperity, as distinguished from the false, inflationary conditions presently existing. As a first step, the nation's business, industry, and other agencies and organizations of production must be freed from the ever-increasing intrusions of government into the affairs of these institutions and organizations. This nation achieved its economic greatness under a system of free enterprise, coupled with human effort and ingenuity, and thus it must remain. This will be the attitude and objective of this party." And they go through, they say there must be an end to inflation and the ever-increasing cost of living. This is a vital concern to the laborer, the housewife, the farmer, the small businessman, as well as the millions of Americans dependent upon their weekly or monthly income for sustenance. It wrecks the planned lives and retirements of our elderly, who must survive on pensions or savings gouged by the standards of another day. So, this might sound familiar to some people. High inflation, false economic prosperity, declining living standards. Perhaps this might sound familiar to some certain people, perhaps living in the United States in the year 2022, or maybe even the late 2021, who knows. But This problem has existed before, and the Dixiecrats have, formulated their plan to it already. And then they give a full miniature manifesto to farmers, which is the big thing. We mentioned earlier when Sam Batch was here, the American sections. Farmers were their own coalition. They formed the backbone of the Dixiecrats due to that plantation system that developed. Here you get the miniature American Independent Party manifesto to them, and it's a small point plan. I'll just read a couple. Point 1, we pledge ourselves to the protection and preservation of the family farm, which is the backbone of American agriculture. Point 2, we pledge that the new Secretary of Agriculture will immediately begin to support prices at 90% of parity, which is the highest level provided under present law. So this is where they get very interventionist, because this is their support base. This is their cultural base, the American farmer in the Great Plains, the South, somewhere in the Midwest even, reaching into Missouri and southern Indiana, southern Ohio. This is sort of like the American Dixiecratic backbone, whether or not it's in the South. Some of them would support Republicans, but they would look a lot like what we're describing here. So they have no issue basically heightening, prices for the agricultural sector, lowering them either for the benefit of the farmer. Yeah, forgive me. They'd be lowering the mechanical costs, and they would also be increasing the price of the goods just so that farmers can make more money. Typical, political promises for intervening in a sector for political popularity. And this goes on for, I believe, 17 points right there. They have a labor manifesto. They have an education manifesto. Not exactly what we're looking at, science and technology. This is a full comprehensive manifesto that you can read on your own time. However, the thing that we are going to be looking at, something that's a side note here, the veterans policy might seem very familiar today. We'll get to the party switch here in a second, but the story goes with the party switch, we'll elaborate on this more, is the Dixiecrats fled to the Republicans. And part of the reasoning for that is because, well, you can see the Republicans start getting much more interventionist and much more supportive of veterans after the supposed party switch. If you remember back to our analysis of the 1948 Republican Party manifesto, probably about half an hour ago, they had their own sort of tacit support, or not tacit, but their own sort of a weak support for veterans. The Dixiecrats here, though, go into rhetoric that most Americans might find familiar in the modern day. To quote directly from the American Independent Party platform, they say, quote, America owes no other group of citizens so much as it does our veterans. To that group of self-sacrificing and patriotic individuals who have risked their lives for our nation and its principles in past wars and conflicts, and to our brave men and women returning from service in Vietnam, we pledge the support of the American Independent Party. We pledge to you and your dependents our assurance of active and vigorous assistance in seeking out job opportunities, job training, further educational opportunities, and business opportunities. We likewise support a program to provide educational benefits to children of deceased veterans in order that they may receive a quality education and participate in America's competitive society of the future. Does that sound familiar to anyone at all? Anyone that has listened to like a political speech anytime in the last 20 years or so, especially post 9/11, post intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq. Like, it's the exact same rhetoric, the exact same diction, almost verbatim in some cases. Just replace Vietnam with Afghanistan or Iraq. So, that's why some people will say the party's flipped. We'll get to that in a second. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Then we also get foreign policy. If you remember back to the beginning, they endorsed George C. Wallace, the Alabama governor, and Curtis LeMay, the Air Forceman, basically seen by the public as the leader of the Air Force. And if you go to someone like Thomas 777 or Paul Fahrenheit, they could give you much more information off the top of their heads than I could about Curtis LeMay. What it is worth noting is that the public perceived LeMay to be absolutely insane. They were worried that if he got control of any sort of levers of power, he would advocate for nuking things like Vietnam. He would advocate for glassing Manchuria. He would advocate for, hostile, aggressive action against the Soviet Union. This is how the public perceived him. This obviously doesn't play well in polls, but their foreign policy, as a result of nominating LeMay, and he was no idiot. He was a very intelligent man, at least by, it seems, by military standards, or at least by the mainstream standards. I'm sure there could be differing beliefs. Curtis LeMay definitely was a hawk. And so the American Independent Party foreign policy is going to read as follows. One of the greatest needs of our country at this moment in history is a strong, realistic, well-defined policy to guide our relationship with the other nations of the world. The policy developed to govern our actions in foreign affairs must be one well stated and well understood, first by our own people and, equally as importantly, by friends and foes alike throughout the world. The absence of any such well-defined and consistent policy throughout the past 2 decades has contributed immeasurably to the chaotic world and conditions now existing. This again might sound familiar, having presidents cycle between hawks and doves. This was the exact same way that it was between 48 and 68. You would get presidents that were more hawkish. You would get presidents that were more dove-like, at least by popular perception. So Truman and Eisenhower, LBJ, considered much more hawkish, just because of their interventions, because of their support for the military. Eisenhower probably slightly less so than the others, but still up there, probably owing to the fact he was a general himself. Kennedy was seen as more dove-like, or dovish, despite the fact of that he had the Cuban Missile Crisis and played brinksmanship. Kennedy himself was seen as sort of the dove candidate for the 1960 election. Nixon was seen as slightly more hawkish. This works well if you're a political party and you want like specific policy positions to lambast your opponents with. They're too hawkish or they're too dovish. But this doesn't really work if you want a consistent foreign policy so that people around the world know what you're doing and don't accidentally launch nukes at you if you make a wrong statement. This is what they're talking about. And just to give sort of what they're talking about here, we'll read the last 2 paragraphs from the foreign policy section. The American Independent Party states, quote, "We feel that the road to peace lies through international cooperation and understanding. We will pursue this goal to the limits consistent with our own national interest. We will become participants in international programs of aid and development from which all member nations, including our own, derive benefit. We will not abandon the United Nations organization unless it first abandons us. It should be given fair opportunity at resolving international disputes. However, we will not subordinate the interest of our nation to the interest of any international organization. We feel that in this organization, as in any other, participating members should bear proportionate shares of the cost of operation, and we will insist on financial responsibility on the part of the member nations. We also feel that the officers and officials of such organizations must conduct themselves with an abstract air of objectivity and impartiality, and we will so insist. We will give this organization every opportunity to succeed in its purpose, but should it fail, we will reappraise our relationship with it." So this might sound very similar to Trump's position on NATO, at least in his rhetoric, not in actually what happened. If you remember back to the election and right in the early years of his presidency, he was saying a lot of, turned out to be fluff, of people need to up their contribution so that America just stops bankrolling NATO, or America would withdraw because it's no longer in America's interests. But if they do contribute though, then by all means we'll stay in. That was sort of that was what the Trump position was. That's been what a lot of isolationist positionism is on international organizations. So too it is in 1968 with the American Independent Party. So they have a section on foreign aid and export-import, balance of payments, the Middle East. That's a thing as well. Europe, just because of some of the arguments that have happened in the last week. Why don't we take a cursory glance into Europe? The American Independent Party says, "We continue to regard Western Europe as an area of vital importance to America, and are concerned with the interminable conflict in Southeast Asia. We must not lose sight of the strategic importance of our relationship with our European allies. We must retain a posture of strength in this area and must work with and for our allies to ensure that they remain economically and militarily strong. We will continue to support the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and seek to strengthen it through the cooperative efforts of all member nations. We will retain the necessary troop strength in this vital area and will insist that our allies and member nations do likewise." So, maybe it's more of a modern phenomenon that some of our European friends point to, but at least here, the people that are the most hawkish in American society are calling on European armies and financial support to actually help themselves. And you can read the rest of this for yourself. Cuba, it goes through the entire world. Vietnam has its own section because the war was still raging at that point in time. Lyndon B. Johnson had massively escalated American involvement in Vietnam. So that's what you're looking at there. Just to we'll just take a look back here near the top in local government. Civil rights appears once on this document for the Dixiecrats. The American historiography, or just any historiography you use, paints the American Independent Party as a one-issue party, George Wallace as a vehement segregationist that just tried to impose it on the rest of the nation, and Curtis LeMay as a sniveling war hawk. Civil rights is mentioned once in this entire platform. And sure, you can go and find their media appearances and whatnot. There's a famous interview with George Wallace and William F. Buckley. Wallace absolutely, schwacks him in that debate, but that's beside the point. This is a very comprehensive, very almost reactionary platform going against sort of social, political, and economic turmoil. Rising price inflation, the declining value of the dollar in terms of purchasing power for the consumer, increasingly convoluted and globalist international commitments, absolute chaos and ethnic confusion in the cities, complete destruction of the actual culture of the American cities. This was a conservative or a reactionary platform, and probably one that most dissidents on the right today would look at this and say that it's absolutely great. And of course, they have their conclusions. So I figured we would run through that. This is what the last gasp of the Dixiecrats themselves believed in, and perhaps it scales with the decline of American society. But they went from basically from a stated one-issue group, oppose integration, to fix American society. So as you can see, the difference here between the 1948 Oklahoma City Convention for the States' Rights Democratic Party, and then you can look at the full comprehensive manifesto of the American Independent Party over here in 1968. So that's what they believed from their own mouths. And we could go through the Republicans and the Democrats. That's a stream for another time. Humphrey and the Democratic Convention went absolutely insane. Nixon was being Nixon and was begrudgingly going along with whatever social view was there. Personally, of course, as we know from his tapes, he was very much against sort of the integrationist and progressive cultural domination. But this is what the Dixiecrats themselves believed. What happened in the 1968 election? Well, Wallace carried most of the South. I forget specifically which states. I think it might have been North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. Might have been Florida as well. And Louisiana, if I remember correctly. Basically, he took a lot of key parts of the South. Wallace did. he was not expecting, despite the fact that this platform is meant for the whole country, realistically, he and his campaign manager was not expecting to, just sweep the entire country. They focused most of their campaigning in the South, also less remembered in the city of Boston in the Northeast due to the busing controversy. I'm hoping to line up a few interviews with people that you guys might have heard of who were there at the time that actually saw a Wallace rally in Boston and the support that it elicited. And then you also had support for Wallace and with the unions in sort of the Midwest around manufacturing communities, and also with farmers in the Great Plains. Culturally, though, culture would be the biggest factor for if someone voted for Wallace, which is why if you look at a sort of attempted maps at Dixie culture and the 1968 election, you will notice a very close to a 1-to-1 correlation between if someone is Dixie and if someone voted for the Dixiecrats or Wallace or whatnot. So that was never the plan, the full national campaign. Of course, any national benefits they got would be well received. What the plan was to throw the election to the House. If you, throw the election to the House, to the states, really. Because if you don't get a majority of the Electoral College, if I remember correctly, the proper electoral procedure is that basically states will vote on what will get to vote for the president. What this would do is it would allow George Wallace, with his massive influence in both the House and the Senate of the U.S. Congress, to basically pressure Richard Nixon at this point into being much more strong on social issues, like the Civil Rights Act, like law and order, like foreign policy, like opposing progressivism. That was the main plan for the Wallace campaign. As some of you might know, with the Nixon presidency and administration, he would end up doing this anyways. So it's unclear as to how much of this threat of being flanked from the right by Wallace, it's unclear how much this pushed Nixon to be himself more right wing. But this was the attempt. So after the 1968 election, now that we know what the Dixiecrats are, we can stop sharing this. Now that we know what the Dixiecrats actually are, we can look at the other question of the stream, the party switch. Did it happen? What even is it? To what extent did it happen? Let's look at it. So in modern American historiography, the thing that usually gets taught is that the Democratic Party used to be evil, racist conservatives and whites. It used to be a white interest party. And the Republican Party used to be nice, cozy, warm progressives, a la Teddy Roosevelt. If you just forget the immigration and racial policies that Teddy Roosevelt had, we'll just say that that's what usually gets taught. I remember hearing most of that on my own. What the story usually goes is that because of Richard Nixon and because of his more conservative strain of the Republican Party, they couldn't be as warm and progressive as they used to, especially since the Democratic Party was starting to put out much more progressive, much more radical presidential candidates. Therefore, Richard Nixon, with this happy, warm, progressive GOP, needed to start focusing on the more evil, reactionary, conservative elements of American society. And in doing so, what usually gets called the Southern strategy was implemented. He would focus on issues that would be very integral to Southern voters and Southern populations, as if this is some mark against him. And of course, this means that now Richard Nixon is the evil, racist, white supremacist, which deserves to be thrown into the fires of historical ignorance. So, as a result of the Southern strategy from the evil, terrible Nixon, the Democratic Party was forced to adopt more and more progressive measures because now that's their only power base left. And so, as a result of Nixon's 1970 and 1972 strategy, he ends up realigning the GOP around conservatism and evil, reactionary, white supremacy, and the Democrats become the warm, fuzzy Progressive Party with Hubert Humphrey, and then later, you would get unsuccessful presidential bids, like in the 1972 election. You would get people later like McGovern that would support things like abortion to the late 1900s American society as a moral good, basically. Not that popular, still not that popular even. So what actually happened from my perspective? This is where Sandbach was supposed to come in with probably a contrarian perspective. But I think given the party positions that we just outlined, it's easy to see that the Republican Party has not really changed in the span of almost a century. They still use the same rhetoric, give or take a little here or there. They might be a little bit more hawkish in the nowadays due to the neocon influence. But even then, their rhetoric is still very much the same. Support veterans with pensions. God bless our greatest warriors. God help them for preserving our liberty. They were saying this stuff. They were saying this stuff back in the 40s, especially coming out of World War II. The Democratic Party, the progressives, as we've discussed, were already championing full equality back in 1948, if you recall back to the Democratic 48 Manifesto. They were championing it. They were completely decrying any inequality on any grounds. They were pushing for constitutional amendments for the equality of women. It's not hard to see that they were already quite progressively captured in 1948, let alone going back into FDR and his coalition when he kicks out John Nance Garner, whenever he is the one that did the deplatform Father Charles Coughlin. All these other sort of Democratic coalition members just get completely sidelined and have no method of recourse. Republicans haven't changed then. The Democratic Party at that point in time had been very progressive. Then we can probably blame that on Franklin Roosevelt just for simplistic purposes. The Dixiecrats, which is sort of the catalyst for the party switch in the popular historiography, they didn't change either. They kept their issues. As we saw, it was just that 48 was a more one-issue election for the Dixiecrats. We're going to oppose civil rights, and that's all they wrote about in their 9-point manifesto. And then 1968, 20 years later, suddenly the country had changed so radically that all they were advocating for alongside that one-paragraph opposition to the Civil Rights Act was just normal American society before FDR, basically. And taking some of his welfare maybe to a limited extent. There's not really much change here at all either. So the only thing that really seems to happen from my perspective, and this is where I would call in Sandbach, perhaps we'll revisit it and just have a stream on the party switch alone. Hopefully he's not, I hope he doesn't blame himself for not being able to be here, given that's the connection that was the issue. It seems to me that the parties have not really switched. The only thing that actually switched was that the Dixiecrats went from being nominally part of the Democratic Party to being independent for basically an election cycle, and then coalitioning around Nixon because that was the only choice they realistically had. As such, I think it's clear to see that the party switch did not happen, but perhaps we'll get maybe even a substack from Mr. Sandbach to dispute that. But regardless of all that, some of you might have expected this from me. I believe I've made this point on many streams before, that the parties did not switch. The Democratic Party just became more progressive. Now you kind of see how I can make that claim. It's not that they just became more convinced of progressivism. It's more that the progressives cooed the party, first with FDR, and then with the 68 DNC, and then the DNC reforms that resulted thereafter. I believe it would be the McGovern Committee that democratized the party. So with that, and now hopefully some of you know what the Dixiecrats are actually on about, rather than just joking about Jim Crow and literacy tests. And that's the other thing. You didn't see literacy tests mentioned once in any of those Dixiecratic political manifestos that they themselves wrote. Right? This is the one chance for the Dixiecrats to let the world know exactly what they want. And they didn't mention any of the cliches that modern historiography tells you about, which should be cause to go and read the rest of it just so that you can get actual history into your mind and memory rather than a political narrative that is so obviously out of reality that it's laughable. So, with that, that's my point of view. Just looking at this ad hoc, trying to plan this for the future. Hopefully, we can revisit this with Mr. Sandbach. I quite enjoyed talking to him on stream. I was heartbroken that it did not happen that way today. And hopefully, everyone enjoyed the impromptu, basically solo stream today. I had no preparation for what I just went over, just for the simple fact that I was expecting Sandbach to be here, and so was Sandbach himself expecting to be here. So with that, we will start getting into the closing. Prince of Parma for 35 South African Rand says, couldn't catch this live. Hope it was a good stream. I think it went well. It could have gone a lot worse. I could have canceled again, which I didn't particularly want to do. And I hopefully this sort of impromptu organization fit everyone as well as it could. I know it's not the absolute highest quality. That would, of course, require Sandbach to be here, not at the mercy of his internet connection. But I did the best I could. So hopefully everyone has learned at least something. So with that, I think that was our only super chat for today. And so if you all like what is happening here, there is a Subscribestar link in the description. If you like the work that I'm doing, I'm trying to make sure that this happens regularly. In the future, if there is an issue that comes up, I might just keep doing these solo streams if it was positively received enough. If people thought that this was hot garbage, of course I won't subject anyone to this again, and take up a Saturday morning and have people think that something quality is here when in fact it's not. But if people like this, if something happens with the guests, then by all means we will do this solo stream again. And once again, hopefully you all learned something. Hopefully there's a historical myth here that has been dispelled, at least in the how the Dixiecrats are how the Dixiecrats are portrayed. The party switch, I was hoping Sandbach would be here for, because we can't really talk about that without the opposing view. So anyways, thank you all for watching today. Make sure to check the description if you do feel inclined to support. The thing about using the Subscribestar is I get more of a cut of it, and Alphabet, the corporation that runs YouTube and Google, gets none of it, since it's not their platform. So I think it's a good idea to start switching financial support over to there. And if we get enough people that actually are over there, I will start checking that on stream instead of just trying to throw it in at the end of the month to check the donations over there. So thank you all for joining. Hopefully you all enjoyed. Genuinely do let me know in comments this time, because this is something unprecedented on my part. And with that, I hope you all have a good Saturday morning. Goodbye, everyone.